Hello, my name is Michael, and Delusion is a brand new early access game on Steam created by James Ragg. And as you can see, it is a retro PS1 aesthetic style RPG played in the first person, and I have almost never bought any games in early access because I always thought, well, I just want to wait until it's done and then I'll play it. But this one, the minute I saw a screenshot of it, I was just in love with the look and the style of this game, and I had to get it. And it turns out that was a great decision because Delusion is an absolutely fascinating and excellent game that I would highly recommend everyone go and check out. I am going to be leaving the link to the Steam store page in the description if you want to go check it out. It is currently $20 on Steam, and I think it was definitely worth it, even without the game being finished. Because I've played so many countless hundreds of RPGs in the past, for a new one to really hook me, it has to have a fascinating and unique audiovisual presentation, and that is what Delusion gives you. On this fantasy world, the planet itself has essentially been destroyed. A titanic cataclysm has ruined the entire surface of the Earth, and humanity exists only on floating islands in the atmosphere that they can travel between with flying ships of various kinds. And I was immediately struck by this image of people clinging on by their fingernails to the very last remnants of any sort of civilization. Humanity seems to be close to dying out if things get any worse. And because the planet below is effectively ruined and presumably cannot be fixed by any means, this really seems to be the limit of human civilization for the rest of eternity on this planet. The retro PS1-esque visuals of the game immediately hooked me, and I understand that that's not going to be something that everyone is going to be into. They're not going to like that particular era, but because I grew up in the 1990s and have played countless games in the PS1, I absolutely love this style, and it is absolutely no problem to me. And in fact, I actually like this style, and very recently, over the past maybe 5 years or less, the retro PS1 style has become more and more common among indie developers. You can even see that with the PlayStation 1 demake of Bloodborne, and people are really beginning to appreciate this era of gaming instead of just casting it aside when we have more complicated models of characters and backgrounds in the later generations. It has its own unique quality to it that makes it stand out. There's a certain eeriness, a certain maybe uncanny valley adjacent style to the PS1, where we see something as clearly the human form, or we can recognize what is being represented, but it adds something that makes it uncanny, or eerie, or creepy, or, whatever you want to call it, where you can recognize the object, but it isn't quite right. So it makes it feel in a way sort of like a memory that you had from long ago, where you can still see vague flashes of it in your mind, but everything has been distorted and destroyed over years or decades of the brain's memory degradation. So you don't quite have everything there, it's just sort of a cerebral recollection of it. And I think that there's actually something to be tied into the later 19th century fin de siècle impressionism art, where instead of focusing on making things look as realistic as possible, which they had for much of the 16, 17, and most of the 1800s, once photographs became commonplace, artists began to turn away from realism and instead make hazy, vague remembrances of things that once were, as they would appear in the mind, and we can analyze how that makes you feel by looking at your own memory reflected on you. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that I adore the PS1 retro aesthetic, and if you're not into it, I understand, but at least give it a try, because this is one of the best looking games I've seen in years. Of course, it's not the best looking in the traditional sense of graphical fidelity, which I don't give a toss about, but in terms of the artistic creativity of the world that they've made, where you can see the artist's conception right there and the idea that they had in mind that they're trying to replicate for you. And I was just in love with looking at the game, even without the gameplay, just looking at everything around there. There are actually parts of the game we're going to get to later where it's actually not finished, and you can just go there and, because it's in early access, there's just the backgrounds of the world without any people or monsters there, and it's still fascinating just to look at it. So I can't praise this game's look and feel highly enough. I especially love that weird pink star in the sky. These things are neuron stars, and there is an entire subplot that I found really interesting, where they seem to be suggesting that cosmologically this world and these so-called god creatures that exist within it have a strange mirroring quality towards the human brain and how we think and function. And that actually reminded me a little bit of Twin Peaks Season 3, where we see the evolution of the arm as a strange blob of brain on top of a tree. And within the brain there are structures known as dendrites, and you may recognize the root term there, dendra, meaning tree. And so there's a strange connection there between the world, our conception of it, the use of faith by the people on the world to conceive of it in a certain way, and strange alien creatures that prefer to call themselves gods, that use human worship in order to create a kind of magical interaction. In other words, create things, sort of like how a thought is created by the electrical impulses along our dendrites in the brain. But anyway, getting to the basic story, we start out as a prisoner on an inquisitorial ship. I've seen some people suggest that there is sort of an Elder Scrolls reference here, and that the game is Elder Scrolls-like, but I didn't really feel that at all. Aside from you starting as a prisoner, it really reminded me much more closely of the PS1-era King's Field games, and maybe a little bit of the Shadow Tower series. Maybe they're just using it for marketing to say it's like Elder Scrolls, but it doesn't really quite feel like that. Although there is a similarity to Fallout that we're going to get to later on. So anyway, you begin as a prisoner on this ship, and it seems that this world of floating islands in the sky is home to a number of creatures that are traditionally referred to as gods. And I say traditionally referred to as gods because we actually see a few of these alleged gods, and it really reminded me of Silent Hill.
God? Are you sure you don't mean devil?
Whichever you like.
Because they prefer to be called gods, but in reality they're monstrous, Lovecraftian or Cronenbergian monstrosities that are trying to manipulate people, at least as far as I could tell. All of the gods we meet are these hideous, fleshy beings that are clearly pretty hostile to humanity, and are just tricking people into worshipping them, but unfortunately, large numbers of humans in their desperation and misery and ignorance still worship these gods throughout the islands. Recently in the history of this world, a political alliance called the Apostatic Union, apostatic from the word apostate, was formed in order to overthrow the theocracy that governed humanity for many centuries. And this anti-religious organization, it almost reminded me a little bit of the early Soviet Union and their militant atheism, where they were trying to break and destroy religion, turn cathedrals into storage retractors and things like that, and, you know, they mete out brutal repression to all of the people trying to worship these deities. So it's kind of miserable and sad to see all these people they've hanged and gibbeted around the islands, and they're clearly portrayed to be cruel and fanatical. But it almost has a Warhammer 40k feel to it, where, yeah, they are cruel and fanatical. They're also fighting against the worship of these monsters. So I love that there's no good option. It's not like there's some sort of sunshine and rainbows option where if we just do this, everything's gonna work out. It's like, no, we may need to do this in order to survive, but it's absolutely horrible and will just leave us in a kind of grimdark situation. So anyway, you happen to be a prisoner for unknown reasons in one of these inquisitorial ships, and presumably you're going to be butchered along with all of the other prisoners they've captured who were worshipping deities or run afoul of the Apostatic Union, but you happen to be let out for some reason or another, maybe manpower shortages, by one of the Inquisitors and tasked to track down a piratical, sort of rogue traitor-ish woman who is maybe worshipping deities and a cult fanatic and trying to create some sort of probably monstrous hellscape with the help of these deities she's been capturing and using for her own purposes. But you're let out to go find her, and you begin to explore this fascinating series of islands. The game is played from a first-person perspective, and as you might imagine, there's a fair bit of combat involving both melee weapons and bows. I don't know if there are other weapons aside from swords, daggers, and bows. I didn't find any. Maybe there will be in other versions, but those are the only ones that I found here. And you can also use some magic to supplement your arsenal. And, if there was one criticism I would have to give to this game, it's that the combat was not exactly the most thrilling thing there. The combat is a very basic affair. It's not really very challenging. I never died even once in combat. It seems very slow and kind of easy to bob and weave around enemies and hit them from the side. It does feel a lot like the King's Field games in a way, because you do have a stamina bar that is gradually being depleted, but the enemies just really didn't seem to hold all that much threat, and your character is unlikely to die unless you just get completely distracted and look away from the screen for several seconds. You're almost certainly not going to die that way. In fact, the only way that I died at all in the game is by falling off the edge of the island. And I have a little bit of a hint for everyone in case you're playing this game. You may want to fall off the edge of one of the maps just once. That's all I'll say, but you may want to give it a try. Admittedly, this isn't the focus of the game. Combat is just an element to add a layer of threat to your explorations. Maybe it will be tougher in the final release of the game, although I don't imagine it will be. It's just kind of middling, but that's not really the whole point of the experience here, the combat. You can start out in a number of different class directions, including being a basic fighter, a spellcaster, or a rogue, and you can upgrade along any path you want. Sort of like the Elder Scrolls games, if you want to get some thief skills along with your fighting, and even though I only played this game for about 12 hours before I exhausted all of the content in the game, or virtually all of it, I was able to get so much XP over time that I was basically good at everything. I was a good fighter, I was a good thief, and I was a good spellcaster. I think the only thing that I left behind there was charisma. My speechcraft wasn't exactly very good. But you get so much experience in the game, it really, you can go along a bunch of different paths simultaneously. Speaking of XP, the game does not refer explicitly to experience points. Instead, they're called delusions. And these delusions that you gain allow you to upgrade your skills. And it's really interesting that it's even called a delusion, and I think that may be a major part of the story, that we're just sort of like faintly imagining something happening in a dream, or it's, in the words of Harry Mason from Silent Hill 1,
A world of someone's nightmarish delusions come to life.
It's a way to transmute your thoughts into a carnal way in order to affect the world. And I just thought that was interesting that they didn't go for the basic experience point route. It sort of is tied into the world and the lore of the game, and I really enjoyed that. Exploring the world is actually one of the most difficult things in the game, because like those old King's Field games, you either have no map at any point, or a very vague map that is not something you can instantly follow around, and you will get lost constantly while playing this game. Even though the overall landmass in this early access version is fairly small, it is very easy to get mixed up in where exactly you're supposed to go, what you're supposed to interact with, what you have and haven't gone into. All of the houses in each separate area kind of look the same, so it can be a little bit confusing wondering where you've gone at each point. That's not a terrible thing about the game, but it was a little bit of a nuisance, but I think you're supposed to really sink into this game and carefully explore every single area you can go to see what you can find. The monstrous creatures that you can fight in the game are all very interesting looking. There are goblins who have this strange face mask that they wear all the time, supposedly because of some ancient sin that the goblin race committed in the ancient past, and they now have to sort of hide their features from others. And that's an interesting way to take just a random mob enemy and make it exciting, adding this story part to it that made me really intrigued about it and want to learn more about these goblins instead of just hacking them to bits. Although, they are goblins. I hacked a lot of goblins to bits. The game actually has a sort of New Vegas-like reputation system, which admittedly in this early access version is not really fleshed out very well, but it was fun to see that if you kill large numbers of bandits, you will have a bad reputation with any bandit you happen to meet, and the same with goblins the apostatic union with the worshippers of various religions, and it hasn't really been fleshed out more than that, so I can't really talk about it, but that was an important way the game kind of distanced itself, I thought, from the standard murder hobo plot, you going around and just killing everything you see. When you're not going around killing everything you see, you can go to a few towns in the game, which are filled with, the standard taverns and shops, and you can rob some of the shops if you go back at night. There is a day-night cycle, by the way, in this, which adds yet another layer of fun and complexity. Probably my favorite area in the game was an island filled with the Endless, and the Endless are this game's version of the undead. So they're sort of like zombies or ghosts or revenants that are hanging around in these gigantic crypts or mausoleums, and there are these ghostly entities that will attack you if you get too near. Probably my favorite moment of the entire game was with these Endless, and we find out that the Endless need to consume human flesh in order to survive. And they used to get their flesh free range, you might say, by attacking other islands and kidnapping people and then eating them when they got back. But this sort of struck some of the Endless as being immoral, because, obviously it is. And so they decided to create these gigantic mounds of living meat in order to consume what they need to survive without actually physically harming any people. And to your horror, you discover that these mounds of meat are actually gaining some kind of limited sentience that the Endless are unaware of, and you can actually telepathically communicate with them and find out that they very much are in pain and do not want to be eaten. Like I mentioned before about the grimdark world, there's really no good answer here, because you can either destroy the living creature that's trying to be sentient, or you can let it live and convince people not to eat the giant meat slab thing, but that would also make the Crusader suddenly rise up again and attack other islands, so that's not really a good resolution. But that's just one story in this fascinating world, and I really want people to try it out, and I'm really looking forward to the full game being released maybe 6 to 8 months from the recording of this video. Dread Delusion is pretty much the perfect game for me, because it is a role-playing game with a horror aesthetic. So maybe I'm not being absolutely as objective as I should be when looking at it, but I just think this game is pretty much perfect all around, with that minor quibble about the combat not being as challenging as maybe it should be. The game seems to have been originally conceived as part of a game jam by some indie devs who spent a very short amount of time working together in order to make a game where this was conceptualized originally. And it's very impressive that they were able to flesh out so much from their original burst of creativity together a few years ago. And even though the game has a horror aesthetic, as I said, with a world of the undead, a sort of inquisitorial medieval world, and a hyper-industrialized hellscape in the Clockwork realm, the game is certainly not without humor. In fact, most of these very serious themes are told with a sort of wry comic tone most of the time, where the game isn't taking itself deadly seriously. And there's plenty of silly, I would say, like, early JRPG comedy thrown in there with the side characters in the various cities. The music in the game, created by a man named DStaley56 on Twitter, is a wonderfully retro blend of these synthesizer washes that make a kind of vaporwavy kind of feel. I really enjoy the opening track that you hear at the start of the game. I just think it's so soothing and relaxing, and it's almost hypnotic, and it's sort of like being tranquilized before going into this really creepy nightmare place. In fact, I kind of wish I just had this one track just sort of following me around during the day, keeping me calm. Obviously, we don't have more than a few tracks at this stage of development, but from what I've heard, I think it's going to be an amazing, very atmospheric contribution to this game world. The 12 or so hours I've experienced of Dread Delusion has given me the impression that this is going to be an amazing game once it's finally finished. And I've already got my money's worth exploring this amazing set of islands in the early access version, and I'm going to leave a link to the store page, as I mentioned, in the description in case you want to go check this out. I'm just eager to find out where the story goes, or even if the plot doesn't ultimately lead to something amazing and revelatory. I just think the little stories of the worlds and these tiny little islands, seeing these surreal and nightmarish creatures, and getting into the nitty-gritty of the political landscape surrounding these gods is interesting enough. I would really like to find out if they explain more clearly if someone is lying about the cataclysm that destroyed the world. Was it really these more atheist-minded scientists that were pushing technology too far? Or was it the gods and their worshippers? Or was it somewhere in between? Or was everyone lying and there's some other way? And there's some other reason for the cataclysm? I think there's just so much interesting stuff here, and I haven't really been this excited about an indie project before. I think that we have a brand new age of amazing indie developers. So anyway, Dread Delusion. Surreal, horror, incredible retro aesthetic, highly recommended. And let me know if you've heard of this game and if you plan on checking it out, or what you think about the retro PS1 aesthetic in general, and what your thoughts on this game and games like it are. And my name is Michael. Try not to worship any demonic hell beasts masquerading as deities, and have a great night.
Though eternity lies before thee, thy work in the land of the living is not done. Return, brave ones.
And watch more videos.